Okay, let me share this. Now these are all different. Great. No. That one's what we want. Okay, that looks right.
Good.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Whoever else isn't here yet, they'll either miss out, they'll join us, or they'll watch the recording that we will send out in a couple of days. Give us a little bit of time after this class today to get our ducks in a row, but we will send you guys the recording. My name is Caitlin Bainham. I'm the Marion County UF-IFAS Extension Livestock Agent. And today we're doing, Maxine and I have taught this class before. It's our Landscaping for Livestock class. We've maybe improved it a little bit. You guys can be the judge. And it's a cool topic idea that puts both of our expertise into one class for you guys that are farm owners or managers with probably horses on it, and what you can plant that will be safe for your livestock. I'm going to cover a little bit on weed management and my background. I'll give a little bit about my background, and Maxine, if you're still there, I'll turn it over to you real quick to let you give your background, or I guess we'll just do that when I get done. Maybe
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm a horse person myself. I have 4, had to do a quick count right now. And I know Maxine is also a horse person. So we thoroughly enjoy teaching about horses. And I also love talking about pasture management, and Maxine loves talking about the plant aspect. So this is a really cool partnership that her and I get to do together. So I'm going to cover the first part of class this afternoon, and I've termed it Poison in the Pasture. What does it mean and how do you manage it? And so I'm going to take this class as an opportunity to also, again, if you've been in my class, any class before, you've probably heard my spiel on pasture management, but I'm going to take this as an opportunity to, again, talk about some basics of pasture management, the basics of toxic weeds, whether that be toxic pasture weeds, toxic landscape plants. So maybe we can better understand how they work, why they work, and why they are not ideal around our livestock. And then most importantly, hopefully teach you guys how to manage those problem plants. Before we go any further, I just want to remind everybody, you received an email from me on Friday with your instructions to join this webinar. And in that email was a link to a Qualtrics survey, pre-test survey. And we would really, really appreciate if you guys haven't done that yet, if you would jump to that link, go to your email and go to that link. And it's 6 pretty simple questions. You don't have to know the right answers. If you would do that, we would be greatly appreciative. That's one of the metrics that we use to see how effective we were and what we need to change. And then after class today, you will get another link to the post test. So it will look very similar, but it is a separate, totally separate link. So please do not go take the pre-test after class. We won't really be looking at that point, but you will get a new link in the chat box today for the post test, as well as a follow-up email from myself in a couple of days. And I'm skipping around a little bit, so I apologize. Another housekeeping part, if you guys are new to Zoom, you guys are muted by default and you don't have camera access by default of the Zoom webinar platform, but you do have use of the chat box. So please, as I'm going along, feel free to put some questions in the chat box, some dialogue in the chat box, and then once I get done with my section, I will go in there and we can kind of touch base on anything that I may have missed or clarify some key points if you guys were unsure. So I just want to make you aware of that chat box feature, and we will move right along. Okay, so landscaping for livestock. It's a catchy phrase for this class, but ultimately it's about reaching some of the major goals that you guys have as landowners, farm owners, whether that be 5 acres to 10 acres to 500 acres. You guys really are wanting to first and foremost provide a safe, nutritious pasture area for your livestock, whether it be cattle, sheep, goats, horses, whatever your interests are. that's probably your number one priority, is having that safe, nutritious pasture. And then we all want our places, our farms, our homes to be aesthetically pleasing, right? We want them to look nice to the eye, whether you're located in a high traffic area or not. Just for ourselves, we want it to look nice. So landscaping and good pasture management go hand in hand to really kind of putting the final finishing touches on the way a farm looks, while also being that first point of safe and nutritious pasture base for our livestock to graze. So we're really focused on common areas such as fence lines, different barn yards, your barn areas where your animals might have access to. I know driveways are sometimes accessible by your animals for grazing, or sometimes you have to put an injured animal or a quarantined animal somewhere, and sometimes that's the driveway or the barnyard, or even your yard to your house. I know a lot of people, myself included, if it's a nice summer day, I'm going to let one horse or two around the yard, bunch of good grass around there. So we want to make sure that we're being cautious with our landscape that we place in these areas, because our animals are going to have access to them. So that's kind of what we're thinking about as we move into this class. So toxic weeds, we're going to start again with this general discussion about toxic plants. And then we'll transition into actual landscape plants that you're going to want to stay away from. And Maxine will give you some ideas on some plants that would be good or better or okay for livestock. So just generally, toxic weeds, some general information. The largest economical loss to weeds is animal deaths. And I don't like to start with that to scare anybody. It's just a true point. Animals obviously can overconsume or consume a very acutely toxic plant, which can lead to death in some instances. And when that happens, that is the largest economic loss that we have on paper for weeds in a pasture setting. So that's the big why it matters point. And in order to prevent that, we need to be scouting our pastures. But if you don't know what you're scouting for, it's really hard to walk out there. You might say, yeah, I have a weed problem, or I have some weeds on the fence lines. But if you don't know what they are, you're going to have a really hard time knowing how to mitigate those issues and knowing what to do. So again, that's why we're here in Extension, to help you out. If you're in Marion County, Maxine or myself can come to your farm and take a look, give you some specific recommendations for your farm. If you're not in Marion County, that's perfectly fine. We'd be happy to connect you with whoever your livestock or ag agent is in your county, and they would be, I'm sure, more than delighted to get out there and help you out. So again, learn us as your resource in these different adventures. The next point is, and I will hone in on this time and time again, and if you take nothing away, take this away, but pasture management and grazing management is going to be your best prevention for any kind of weed management. If you're not managing the animals that you have in your pastures, there's nothing else you can do to better manage than to manage your animals. So also, we want you to understand, if you're going to use herbicide chemicals as a means to get rid of your weed problem, oftentimes that is a great strategy, but understand proper application for the species that you want to kill. So again, getting with your extension agent, knowing what weeds you have, so we can recommend the proper control method, and you can go about that in the correct way. So weed management in Bahia grass. I'm going to guess if you are a horse owner or horse farm manager, Bahia grass is probably what you have in your pastures, or it's what you would like to have. And so, you know, there's different weeds everywhere. And from one farm to your neighbor's farm, you might have the same exact basic weed problem, or you might have a few weeds that your neighbor doesn't seem to have. And that's because there's what we call a weed seed bank in our soil. And that's why it doesn't matter what you do. If you don't have good grass in an area, rest assured there is a weed waiting to come up in that spot. So there is no shortage of weed seeds that exist naturally. They're transferred by birds, by the wind, by bad farm practices. And sometimes we just give them the chance when we overgraze and we don't manage properly. We're giving that piece of soil a chance to let a weed come through. So what is a weed? That is an important first question. And the answer to that question is that it's anything growing in an area where you don't want it to be growing. So if you consider if we have a Bermuda grass hayfield with Bahia grass in that hayfield, that Bahia grass is a weed at that point, because you don't want that in your Bermuda grass hayfield because it's a Bermuda grass hayfield. So a weed is any species of grass, forage, forb, browse, anything that is in an area that you do not want it to be is a weed. And the problem is that weeds need all of the same things that our grass needs to grow strong and be successful, which is sunlight, water, adequate space, and nutrients. And so you get this competition effect between the weeds that are trying to come up and your good grass, your Bahia grass that you're trying to promote to have that nice, pretty looking pasture that has productive forage that's going to be nutritious and be able to maintain most of your animals on. And so when you're constantly stressing your grass, you're giving those weeds that competitive advantage. So the best approach to managing weeds in your pasture is what we call an integrated approach. And that would be using multiple of the following control methods. And so the first one that we have and that you're probably familiar with is what we call mechanical control, and that's simply mowing. Now, mowing's not going to work for every weed problem that you might have, but in some instances, mowing will help. It's not going to help to mow weeds that have their full seed heads on them. At that point, you're just spreading your problem around. So you again, knowing what weeds you have, knowing the stage in their life cycle is going to be really important. We have biological control, such as biological like beetles for certain weeds. Again, that's only certain species of weeds that we have biological controls for, but that is an option in some cases. And then probably most commonly would be chemical control, which we discussed, which is herbicides. Follow the label. And if you're spraying yourself, make sure you're very familiar with your equipment, you know how to calibrate it. And if not, and if you're looking for somebody, an ag service provider to do this for you, reach out to me. Let me know if you're in Marion County, and I can give you a list of folks who will come and do that for you. That's a great person to have on speed dial if you are managing property, managing a horse farm, because you never know when you're going to need them or what weeds are going to present themselves at some point in time. So always good to make that contact. And as another general rule, weeds are best targeted when they are immature. So depending on, again, the life cycle of a particular weed that you have, you don't want to spray a chemical herbicide on that plant when it's 3 foot high. That's not going to be as effective as if you were to target that plant as soon as you saw it and you noticed that something was starting to come up in your pasture. That is a much better time to apply a chemical herbicide than a month or two later when it's already taken over everything and has already shaded out all of your grass. So grazing management, I call it the ultimate problem solver. Again, if you learned nothing today, please learn, and hopefully you learn much more than this. This is kind of a joke, but really this is a very important part. There's no amount of herbicide or fertilizer that's going to overcome poor grazing management. So that is kind of a rule that we like to live by. You can do a lot. That is a great tool to have these chemical herbicides. They are an excellent pasture management tool, as is amending our soils with fertilizer to promote the forage that we have there. But you have to take care of that forage first and foremost. There's no point in fertilizing dirt. So managing your grazing is the number one thing that you can do to make sure that you have adequate and good forage there. And then you can manage around that to reduce the competition and keep that good forage, that ideal forage, growing healthy. The best way to manage for weeds is to promote your grass. Again, they're going to have this competition between each other. So if you can promote your grass by managing your grazing, fertilizing when needed, as needed, All of these things are going to make sure that your Bahia grass is the thing that's getting that competitive advantage. Adhering to stocking rates. In our area, we would say that's about 1 horse per 2 acres. So you don't want to be putting 3 or 4 horses on an acre and expecting to have really good grass and to not have a weed problem. So stocking rates are very, very important. If you have a small farm, think about implementing a sacrifice area. So your entire farm doesn't look like a dirt lot. You just have one smaller paddock that you know you're sacrificing for the greater good of your farm, or you need to be okay with having weeds in your pasture, even the toxic ones. So I will tell you a little story about the picture that I have on this slide here. And this is a picture of a horse farm that I was called out to because a horse had died, and the vet had thought that it was probably toxic plants, but she knew that she wasn't sure what it was, but she thought that they had creeping indigo, which is a toxic plant. And so she told the owner to call me and have me come out and look for the creeping indigo because she suspected that the way that the horse that had passed away was presenting was a toxic plant issue. So of course I went right out, and this is a picture of the pasture, and I'm looking for creeping indigo at first because that's what I was told, and that is definitely a toxic plant. And I didn't see any creeping indigo, but what I saw was a bunch of these plants pictured here. And they get these really pretty yellow flowers, and it's called showy crotalaria. And this is actually another severely toxic plant, as bad, if not probably worse than creeping indigo. And the owner had no idea what this was naturally. I mean, if you don't study this stuff for a living, you probably aren't going to be expected to know all of these. But this plant was everywhere on this horse farm, and I didn't see any creeping indigo. And so I was educating this owner that, you know, it's I can't tell you for certain, but if it was a toxic plant issue, it's likely that it was this one because it is all over this place. And as you can see, it definitely had the competitive advantage over the grass because it's mostly a lot of bare patches and dirt, not a lot of good growing grass. And so if that horse, and the horse was older, and if that horse was seeking out something to eat, and the major plant there that was green was this weed, then it is a possibility that he, you know, got curious and started to eat this very toxic weed. So, and this is not an isolated issue. This is something that I see a lot in my travels. And so just be aware, if you see something out of place or something, you know, you see this weed all over, take a good picture, bring me a sample, call me, have me come out, and we can definitely look at it together. And maybe it's not a toxic weed at all, and it's just a nuisance weed. But you want to be sure that it's not, because, you know, especially in the wintertime, if those horses are getting curious and they don't have good grass to eat, then they might start to nibble on this stuff. So how do toxic plants affect livestock? So the next few slides do not come from a place of veterinary medicine at all. I'm not really equipped to tell you how that horse is going to act. But a lot of times, you know, people see neurologic effects in their horses, and you wonder, you know, what is it? You know, even if your vet tells you maybe it was toxic plants, and you might be wondering, well, how could that happen? I'm going to explain to you a little bit, you know, how that might be from some of these plants. And so the severity of a toxic plant event is going to depend on a few factors. First and foremost, the amount of the plant eaten. In some cases, what I referred to earlier as being acutely toxic, that means if they eat a little bit of certain plants, it's going to go a long way, and it's going to be extremely toxic, versus other plants that we would term chronically toxic, meaning they need to eat enough of that plant over a long enough period of time for you to notice the effects. That's kind of how we classify toxic plants. So the amount of a plant eaten is the first factor to consider. The next factor is the quality of that plant. So that the stage of that plant when it was eaten can affect the toxicity. Was it a very immature plant? Sometimes you see more toxic plant issues early in spring, when those toxic plants are the first thing to emerge when it gets warmer, and that's what the animals start to nibble on. And those toxic weeds are immature, and they tend to be a little bit more toxic at that stage. And then, of course, the state of the animal. So in that example that I just gave in the previous slide, an old horse in poor condition, maybe just because they're senior horses, are likely going to handle consumption worse than a young, well-conditioned horse. So that's just Mother Nature. So consider the age of your animal and the state of its health as another factor. We already covered the acute versus chronic. So some additional things that might contribute to poisoning by plants. Firstly, starvation. If that horse doesn't have anything else to eat, if you're not providing it adequate forage in the form of, hay, if it's not getting, some grain, or it doesn't have something to munch on and it's hungry, then these animals are going to seek out something in their environment, whether that be getting curious and reaching their mouths up into a tree they shouldn't be nibbling on, eating acorns, or eating these toxic plants that might be out there. They might not mess with them if they had lush forage in the middle of summer, but in the wintertime, it could be a different story if they're hungry. Probably the next two are probably equally common. Accidental consumption. Horses some of them are much more curious than others, and so they might not even know what they're getting into, but they're on the fence line nibbling around for no good reason at all. They might have plenty of forage, plenty of hay. You and I both know these animals. They just, for whatever reason, they will find it, and so it's just accidental. And then just general browsing habits of the animal is how they can find some of the other toxic plants that might be mixed within some good grass. I mean, it's possible for it to still be growing out there, less likely if you have good forage, but still possible. And so just the general habit of how these animals graze might lend its hand to them stumbling upon a toxic weed. But the most common reason that these animals are going to stumble upon a toxic plant is starvation. By and large, toxic plants are not palatable. Usually, with some exceptions, but usually they're not super palatable. So it's going to take some added factors for that horse to really consume enough of it to be a problem, but starvation can certainly make that happen. We talked about the first plants to turn green in spring might be the cause of that accidental grazing incident. And then bored horses is a huge factor. If they're bored in a dry lot and they might be, in perfect body condition, they might even be fat, and you're thinking they don't need any added, feed or hay, they don't need it. When they get bored, they will find it. They will browse in the trees. They will browse on the fence lines just because they have nothing better to do. So keep an eye on your bored horses if they're on some sort of a stall rest or a paddock rest, or just if you think you're doing them a favor because, they don't need to be grazing all that forage because they're in an over-conditioned state. Maybe just give them a lower quality hay or a slow feed net to keep them busy. And I won't exhaust you with this list, but here is some of, and this again is not all of, but some of the ways that these plants can affect your horses and some of the toxic properties that cause that. So I'm sure you guys maybe are familiar with nightshade as being a very toxic plant that is common this time of year and in our area. And nightshade is what we would term a cyanogenic plant, and it affects the oxygen carrying ability of the blood. And this is one that would be considered acutely toxic. It's not going to take a whole lot of nightshade for you to see some issues in your animals. So this is a very important plant to scout for and get rid of. And then there's some other ones on this, like I put the tannins. That's a popular part of oak and acorns. Now, that doesn't mean everybody needs to go cut down every single oak tree on their property, But if your horse eats enough acorns or enough oak leaves for whatever reason, you could see some ill effects of that, because there's tannins in those oak leaves and in those acorns. And that's why sometimes you hear, oh, you've got to pick up every acorn. Again, if it's a balance, if you're providing enough good forage, or they have an area outside of the oak trees to go graze, they're probably not going to ingest enough to see those effects, but it is a possibility. So some of these are very severe, to others that maybe aren't as severe, but like mechanical injury. If they eat a plant that has some thorns or spikiness on their leaves, that can cause lesions in their gums or anywhere in their mouth. And we would consider that mechanical injury. So that's, and there could be actually toxins in the leaves of those plants that have the thorns. So there could be some other effects there too, but again, not a good issue. If they start to get, if their mouth hurts, then that could lead to other side effects, like them not wanting to eat, them not wanting to graze as much. They might start to drop some condition. So keep a watch out for that. But this is kind of a wide range of effects that these toxic plants can have. And I've matched them. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I've tried to match them with some of our common plants in the area that you might see and how they might affect your horse should they venture into it. And you guys will have this material after class. So don't think you have to write all of this down. So now we're just going to run through some pictures of what some of these toxic weeds in your pasture might look like. And then we will get into some toxic landscape. So the first one, I can't give this class without talking about creeping indigo. It is always the most popular toxic weed question that I get. And that's probably because some years ago, before I was in this position, it was kind of an internet craze. Somebody who was good with social media had a horse that had an issue with creeping indigo because it is toxic. And they posted a video on Facebook or somewhere, and it circulated like crazy. And then that's how it kind of became this celebrity weed everybody knew about and feared. And the thing with creeping indigo is, yes, I have seen ill effects from creeping indigo. I have seen it kill horses for sure. But it is a chronically toxic weed, and they have to eat enough of this material over some time for those effects to be seen. And typically, it's not going to grow well if you have really good pasture. Typically it won't. I have seen it grow in decently manicured pasture. So you still want to scout for it. But I would say 8 times out of 10, it grows in heavily trafficked areas. It'll grow in parking lots, in the cracks. It'll grow by the water trough. It's going to grow in those areas that your grass has no fighting chance. And so typically, you have room to worry about this if you have a pasture that is completely bare, no good forage whatsoever. Then yeah, you might have a little bit more room for concern than if you were to have a decent pasture with some pretty good forage out there. You probably don't need to worry about creeping indigo, but always a good idea to still scout for it. And then on these slides, next to the name of these slides, I've put some herbicide recommendations for each of these weeds. So if you happen to know that you have these weeds, then here's your answer right here of what will take care of it. This next one is one we talked about earlier, showy crotalaria. Sometimes it's called rattlebox because when the seed pod dries out and you brush up against it, it sounds like a rattlebox. And this one grows in these huge groups like this. It can, and it'll look really pretty because the yellow flowers are beautiful, but it is also acutely toxic. And then just a side note about creeping indigo's cousin, which this weed's name is hairy indigo, has a similar leaf structure, similar flower, same flower color, but hairy indigo is not toxic at all. In fact, it is sometimes planted on purpose as a forage for cattle. But the growth habit of hairy indigo is much different than its bad cousin creeping indigo. So as you can see in this picture, this is hairy indigo, and it can grow pretty tall, and it's hairy to the touch. If you feel the leaves on it, it's hairy, hence its name. And the leaf structure is larger than creeping indigo. So that's how you can tell the difference. Creeping indigo, as its name suggests, creeps along the ground and is very, very low growing. Hairy indigo can get some height to it. It can be woodier, and it actually has that larger and hairy leaf. So don't get this one confused with creeping indigo. It is not toxic. Just wanted to add that in. Nightshade we discussed. Look for these guys along your fence lines, up under trees. Typically they grow alone, so just the best control for them is to simply pull them out and dispose of them somewhere where your animals are not going to get to them and they're not going to spread. The next one is perilla mint. I see this in pastures a lot. And again, if you can just pull these out, sometimes that is the best method. If you have a lot of them, then turning to a chemical control is probably going to be easier on you. And there's some recommendations there. Sickle pod or coffee bean is another pretty yellow flowered toxic plant. That is a super common pasture weed that I see probably more often than most of these other ones. So look out for that one. Castor bean. Coral ardesia, not only is it toxic, it's invasive. So you certainly want to pull that up, glyphosate it, totally get rid of it. Cherry laurel, any cherry trees, toxic. Bad news. Bracken fern, this is one that is more common in shady areas. I see it off the side of the roads a lot of the time. They'd have to eat a decent amount of bracken fern for it to cause adverse effects, but at any rate, it is toxic. Next, we have a chinaberry tree. I see these a lot on farms as well. Sometimes, you know, folks, again, most of the time, they don't even know what it is and they don't know that it's toxic. Again, the chances of your animal venturing in and taking a bite of it might be small, but at any rate, it is toxic. And this is kind of a chinaberry tree in its wild habitat. And I'll show you another picture of one that's much larger. So oleander, now we're getting into toxic landscape. Yes, so that was my transition from just general toxic pasture weeds into now what you might find in your landscape or what you might find at your garden store where you're looking to purchase your landscape plants. These are ones to definitely stay away from with your livestock in mind. So if you're landscaping your fence rows, your barns, your yards, if your horses are going to be there, definitely stay away from all of these options that I'm getting ready to run through. And again, this isn't all of them, but these are some common ones that I know are in this area. So oleander, as beautiful as it is, it's not recommended for livestock. So maybe another selection. And this is a grown-up chinaberry tree that appears to be in a neighborhood or down a road. And it's a pretty tropical looking tree. Not recommended for livestock. If you have one and you're looking to get rid of this, we don't recommend that you just go spray a herbicide on top of the vegetation. It's probably not going to necessarily kill this entire mature tree, but what we would recommend is to chop the tree down and then paint that stump with glyphosate. Glyphosate is Roundup, and that will prevent that tree from having regrowth. And that would be our best control method for anything that's that large and woody. Philodendron and sago palms, popular choices, not good for dogs or for livestock. Milkweed, great for pollinators, very popular for butterflies. Butterflies love it, but certainly not for livestock. So if you have a butterfly garden or any garden area that you can keep separate from your livestock, great. The pollinators would love to have it. But if it's in an area where your horses might possibly be getting curious or grazing, maybe think about keeping it out of there. Lantana is an interesting one because it volunteers to come up in a lot of pasture settings anyways. And you can also buy it at Home Depot, Lowe's, wherever. And it is beautiful and they come in many different colors. But again, this is one that will cause some photosensitivity issues in your horses. They'll be more susceptible to sunburns and stuff like that should they eat it. It's not acutely toxic. they'd have to get into enough of it to really start to see these issues, but not recommended to plant around your livestock. And if you've ever tried to get rid of a mature lantana plant, then you know that they can be very woody and hard to dig up. So we would recommend, if you can't dig it up, the same thing as the Chinaberry tree, chop it as low as you can and paint it with glyphosate to prevent it from coming back. Yellow jasmine and azaleas, two other very common landscape ideas, not recommended for livestock. And I'm sure Maxine, well, I'm not sure. I think she's gonna maybe go into some options that would be recommended. I know she'll do that, and maybe she'll touch on a few others that wouldn't be recommended. Those are the common ones that I see a lot on farms and that I've learned in this job that are not recommended. So I'm just kind of passing that on to you, but I will leave it to our horticulture expert after my time here with you to go dig a little deeper and go further in that. And then just for general knowledge, maybe you guys have seen these on your place. I know I have seen them on mine. These are some other common pasture weeds that you might run into. These aren't necessarily toxic. This first one, pigweed or spiny amaranth, is quite a nuisance and technically does have some toxic traits associated with it, again, if they consume enough of it. Caesar weed, this is that annoying weed that if you're riding through the woods and you get back to the barn and you have all those little stickers all over your saddle pad, or they get in your horse's mane and forelock or tail, you have Caesar weed to thank for that. And I'm sure we've all fallen victim to tropical soda apple at some point. This is the plant that we actually have a biological control for. There is a beetle that is designed to eat the tropical soda apple leaves. And that's one of the best methods of eradicating it out of a pasture setting. But it gets these awful thorns on the leaves. So if you're dealing with tropical soda apple, make sure you wear a pair of gloves, go with a shovel, dig them up. This is not one that you want to mow because they get these fruits on them that have thousands of seeds inside of them. And so if you run over this plant with your mower, you have just spread tropical soda apple everywhere. And the same is true for this pigweed. This pigweed will seed out like crazy. And if you mow it, you will have pigweed in more areas than you can count. So these are three super common, just general pasture weeds that I wanted to touch on to maybe help you guys out. And again, I've listed the control methods here on the slides. Dayflower is another common one. Pasture Guard is a product that works well, as does Graze on Next. You've probably seen Graze on Next as the primary recommendation for most of these general pasture weeds, and it does a pretty good job in our pasture settings. Dog fennel, again, another one that if you haven't fought it thus far, you probably will at some point. I feel like it's our most common pasture weed anywhere in Florida, and it can be a real doozy to totally get rid of. This is another one that you don't necessarily want to mow, as it can kind of, one of its defense mechanisms is to kind of put out these other runners and just come back with more of vengeance. So the key with the dog fennel is getting to them when they are super immature. When they get as tall as this one is in the picture, they're very difficult to control. So if you start to see dog fennel in your pasture, you really want to get a handle on them when they're just inches tall instead of when they get to be 2 to 3 to 4 feet tall. So tea weed, this is a common springtime weed that I see, and evening primrose. These two are not toxic, but they do have the pretty yellow flower. Just a general pasture weeds that you might come across. And we'll end with this super nice pasture weed, fireweed. Again, fireweed's not technically toxic, but it will cause that mechanical injury that we talked about. If your horses get into fireweed in a bad way, I have seen them, get whelped up with hives and have some severe allergic reactions. And just getting into it a little bit around their muzzles is very uncomfortable for them. And it's kind of incognito a little bit because it doesn't have this bright flower on it to even let you know it's there. And so when you stumble across it, you will know because it will burn like the dickens. So graze on next, pasture guard, great ways to mitigate your fireweed problem. And this time of year, we hear a lot about fireweed. So be scouting for that one as well. Your horses will thank you for it. So in summary of my part here, I'm just going to wrap up with you before I turn you over to Maxine. If you have good forage available, your livestock are likely not going to eat your toxic plants, even if you happen to have toxic landscape somewhere because you didn't know. They likely aren't going to venture into it. I'm not going to tell you 100% of the time that they are not going to venture into it because everybody has that curious horse. Pasture management is your best prevention to a weed issue of any kind. So managing your stocking rate, managing your animal units and how they're grazing your pastures is the best way that you can manage for pasture weeds. And then if you have weeds, which it's impossible to have a pasture and not have any weeds in it, know the life cycle of the weeds that you want to kill so you can do it appropriately and you can target them at the right time. It's not super cheap to apply pasture herbicides, so we want to make sure we're doing our due diligence on learning about the weed that we're trying to kill and we're using the appropriate product. So definitely work with your extension agent to figure that out if you don't know already. And if you're in Marion County, it's me. And if you're not in Marion County, feel free to reach out to me and I would be happy to connect you. And within my slides, I've given you some resources of different publications that you can check out. I have our weed ID and pasture and range management guide listed here. It is an excellent resource. So definitely recommend checking that out. And I think I will stop sharing and I'm going to go to the chat box and see if anything is in there for me. And then I am going to turn it over to Maxine. So Christy asked about yellow wood sorrel. I'm familiar with red sorrel, Christy. Perhaps it's the same thing. And if so, graze on next works really great on that. So I think we're talking about the same weed. And I would suggest graze on next for that. And that's the only question that I see thus far. My contact info, I will put it in the chat box. I'll put my contact info in the chat box so that way I don't take up any more of Maxine's time. Christy, the concentration is going to depend. I mean, my best advice is to read the label. The label is the law and they will always have the concentration. So I will continue to monitor and look at the chat box. So if you guys still have questions for me, I will be in there chatting away at you and I will turn it over to you, Maxine.
Awesome. Caitlin, how's my screen looking? Is that on display mode? Do I need to switch screens?
Yeah, switch screens.
Okay. Better?
That's good.
Excellent. Okie dokie. And I see there is one more comment. Mary Jo asked if stinging nettle is the same as fireweed, and no, stinging nettle has a small white flower and is not nearly as prevalent as firewood weed. Fireweed is pretty noxious. I get it at my place and it's pretty horrible. So we have it both for kids and animals. It's a terrible thing to have on your property and we see it quite frequently. So thanks for having me. That was an awesome intro to toxic plants. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about Florida friendly landscaping and a variety of different things that you can do to keep your landscape safe and use best management practices. So let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to keep an eye on things. And with that, let's get started with our Florida friendly landscaping program if you guys are not familiar with it. So first and foremost, our Florida friendly landscaping program is a 3-part program, which includes our Florida Yards and Neighborhoods homeowners program. We do have a Florida friendly landscaping agent here who teaches that at many of the HOAs. There is a builder and developer program that is more at the state level. And then we also have our industry's best management practices, which is a class that our Florida friendly landscaping agent and myself teach, which is based on fertilizers. So we try to make sure that we keep our fertilizers limited to only what we need. And that is because obviously all of that goes down into our groundwater. So there's a lot of overlap that we're finding as Caitlin and I have learned to work together over the last couple of years between the needs of homeowners and farm owners. And so I think this is hopefully will help you guys a little bit understand where we're coming from. I know I've done several site visits in the last year where we've gone out and farm owners were irrigating multiple times per week on plants that were fully established and did not need that. So we're going to talk about the program as a whole. So Florida Friendly Landscaping is the science-based integrated approach to water and landscape management. And it has 9 principles. And of those principles, it starts out with right plant, right place. This obviously applies to our farms and farm owners, because if something is toxic and you've got livestock or other animals that are going to be in the vicinity, then it is definitely not the right plant in the correct place. So we want to make sure that we get that out of there and plant something that's more appropriate. Sorry, the front office is calling. How to get rid of it? There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So principle number 2 is water efficiently. The third one is fertilizing appropriately. And if you don't fertilize your pastures, you might want to talk to Caitlin about that, because I'm sure she can give you some really good tips on that. Thankfully, Bahia is doesn't need as much fertilizer as some of our homeowner lawns, but it certainly a little boost helps it go a long ways. Mulching appropriately is a big one, and especially if you've got a lot of trees on your farm, it's a wonderful thing. So guys, the front office is calling me. Hey, Caitlin, would you mind running up there and seeing what Kay needs and letting her know I'm teaching?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Sorry, guys. So mulching, one of the things that we see with mulching is trees that are have volcano mulching around them and happen to be smothered basically by the extensive mulch. When that mulch comes up to be above 3 or 4 inches deep, it holds too much water and moisture in and doesn't allow for enough airflow. Attracting wildlife is the 5th principle, and that's really important to me. My background is in wildlife ecology and conservation, and as a 4th generation Floridian, I love working with people to learn more about Florida wildlife. So we'll talk a little bit more about wildlife as we go. Managing yard pests responsibly. So that goes into pest management principles, whether it be weeds or insects or rodents, so we do deal with that a lot when we're talking about farms as well. Recycling certainly plays a role in that, and that means more of recycling yard waste and composting rather than just disposing of manures and not reusing them. Reducing stormwater runoff and protecting the waterfront is our last one. So the whole goal behind this is to create a sustainable source, and especially with as much land as we have here in Marion County that is farmland or livestock land, this can be really beneficial. So anytime we can help conserve water and resources and look at possibly creating additional habitats that we can't create in our HOAs, we're doing good for the environment. So if you have questions on that, feel free to pop them up throughout, and we'll just keep moving along here. So one of the things that we're trying to prevent is this picture here shows a very lush green grass on the side of the St. Johns River. And you can see there is some really nasty algal blooms below. So we don't want to deal with that if at all possible. So definitely not favorable. And all this is a load of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water system, probably running off from the turf and also other water sources. And it all ends up in our water bodies, which creates a big problem for our fish and usually winds up when we hear about fish kills. This is very different than what we hear on our coastlines with red tide. Our blue-green algal blooms will cause fish kills, but they are not the same as the red tide that we get on coastal lands. So when we talk about right plant, right place, a few things to consider is how much sun and shade you get. So this is going towards more of your landscaping around your barn areas, around your homes, any pool enclosures that you might have. If it's going to be dry or moist, is there a need for it to be salt tolerant or chlorine tolerant because there's a pool source there? How about freezes? Do you have a microclimate that gets colder or hotter than other areas? And then of course, what is the mature size? And that's something that we often see skipped over. So definitely don't want to miss that mature size as we plant trees and shrubs, because if they're not properly maintained, they may get much larger than what you would like. Oop, sorry. So looking at right plant, right place. All right, my computer's doing something. Hang on, guys. There we go. So we want to make sure that we match the site soil conditions, light conditions, and other water and climate conditions. We also want to try to buy quality plants. So one of the things that I hear frequently working from the urban residential side is, oh, I bought it on the clearance rack at Lowe's or Home Depot. And of course, we hear that a lot, and that's fine. But oftentimes you can bring diseases home that would not be preferable. So we may not want to do that if at all possible. Make sure you check the underside of leaves before you purchase them, and check for pests. So when you look at the back of a leaf, look for black spots or white spots, trying to look for pests that might be flying off of there. So if you kind of shuffle around in the leaves and you see a flurry of insect activity, that may not be something you want. So definitely something to consider. All right. Also, we like to aim for diversity. Oftentimes when we go into residential areas, we may see neighborhoods that plant primarily 10 or 15 species of plants. And one, it does not help benefit our wildlife or ecosystems. But also, if you get disease or pest problems, they are just go crazy because it's all the same thing. And so those plants are all susceptible to it. And usually what happens at that point is they have to be ripped out and replaced. So, and then lastly, we want to make sure that we try to establish plants that require very little water, fertilizers, and pesticides. One, it's less maintenance and less work for you, but two, it's more environmentally friendly. So that's why we have our Florida Friendly Landscaping website. Those, we also have manuals with diseases. We have disease resistant plants as well as Florida friendly plants. We have lists of them. And again, the book is available in PDF format online. And there's also several interactive websites that I'll share with you as we move on. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about watering efficiently. Landscape irrigation contributes to about 1/3 of the 7 billion gallons of water per day used in the US. And that is actually probably gone up in recent years because our population continues to expand down here in South Florida and Central Florida. And over 50% of that 1/3 percentage is wasted due to overwatering, poor irrigation, and evaporation. And from my job, I see that all the time. So I go out to farms and ranches that are watering their front lawns and their front irrigation, and even oak trees on drip lines, watering them on a daily basis, and it's just not necessary. So generally speaking, how often do you have to water plants once you plant them? Well, if you're planting Florida friendly plants, we usually recommend watering them no less than every other day while they're getting established, which usually is the first 30 to 60 days. After that, they can be reduced to watering once or twice per week, depending on which season it is. And then after about 6 months to a year, the water can be cut off completely if they're planted in an appropriate location. Overwatering increase our pest problems. Also, overwatering and underwatering look almost the same. The symptoms that they create are almost identical. So that can be really hard for us to tell. But when we step out of the vehicle and we step onto spongy ground, because it's saturated, it's pretty easy for us to tell what the problem is. Runoff contributes to the pollution we see here in our water systems, rivers, and springs. And of course, it costs more money. So we try to recommend to people to use the best management practices and try to prevent any excess water usage that's not necessary. So there's some other ideas too. If you're interested in learning more about water conservation and sustainability, feel free to reach out to us. I know some people don't like rain barrels, but there are so many different ways that you can incorporate water storage devices such as cisterns in today's farmland. So it's pretty neat to see. And of course, if you've got farms and you've got livestock that need to be watered, hurricane season, these things come in real handy. I know we've got several cisterns set up at our farm, and it's really amazing because we've got one that's 800 gallons. And if we lose power for a week, we still have plenty of water to keep the farm running. All right, so just a little bit more on watering. When you get ready to plan your landscape, or if you've got something that's not working correctly, and I'll explain that a little bit more, you want to make sure that you group your plants together with similar irrigation needs. So making sure that you don't do what we see in the picture on the bottom left is ideal. One of the things that we see frequently is palm trees and other established mature trees that have perennials or annuals around them that are watered regularly, and then the tree will end up with fungal problems or even root rot issues and end up dying in the long run because they were trying to support annuals too close to the base. So watch out for that and make sure you group your plants together and irrigate them appropriately. And again, if you have any questions on this, feel free to let us know. Also, don't irrigate if you know it's going to rain. Make sure you've got a rain shutoff device that will measure the rain, or else there's several other different meters that you can use, like soil moisture sensors, to check how much moisture is in the soil, and you may not need to water. Hand watering is appropriate. And then lastly, calibrate your irrigation system at least twice a year during the different seasons is what we recommend. And switching over to micro irrigation if possible. So there's just not a lot of need once you have established mature plants to keep them watered. I know Caitlin would be saying some different things about pasture management, but pastures and shrubs are very different. So it really depends on your needs there. So along with watering, usually we consider fertilizing our plants to keep them healthy. So you can see in this plant in the bottom left-hand corner here, it's got some nutritional deficiencies, probably magnesium, possibly a little bit of nitrogen, but either way, it's going to need some fertilizer. Generally speaking, many of your shrubs and trees won't need fertilizer, and if they do, a very small boost once per year is fine. Some things that need more fertilizer than that include palm trees. Palm trees, we usually recommend fertilizing 3 to 4 times during your growing season, which is from March to October. We always recommend using slow release fertilizers, typically at least 30 to 50% slow release, and generally no phosphorus, which means it's 0 is your middle number. So remember, when we're talking about fertilizer bags, there's 3 numbers on the front of the bag. So let's just use 15, 0, 15, for example. That is a pretty decent turf fertilizer that has got no phosphorus in it and is generally slow release. There's several other formulations out there. So like your palm fertilizers, we usually recommend an 8-2, 12-4, but you don't want to overuse any of these. So only fertilize when you know why you're fertilizing. So you don't want to fertilize within 10 feet of any water body, and don't fertilize before it rains. So also here at UF, we don't recommend using weed and feed products. And the reason for that, I always like to tell people the timing of the year is wrong, and people don't always understand that. But basically what happens is you usually feed the weeds instead of killing the weeds, because most of these products are not meant for our southern climate where we get very little cool weather. So if you put the weed and feed products out later in the year, depending on the product type, you very well may end up killing off your turf. Also, if you happen to spill any fertilizer, make sure you sweep it up and reuse it on something that needs it. And don't forget about your soil pH test. And soil pH test can tell you a lot. One, the pH in general can tell you whether you've got the right plant for that spot. So for example, a lot of farms like to use azaleas. Azaleas and camellias are fantastic, but if you've got a pH of 7.5, they're not going to be happy. Same thing if you like to incorporate edibles. Blueberries aren't going to be happy. if you've got that higher soil pH. So there's things that we can do to bring up or bring down the soil pH and adjust it to some extent. Also, if you want to send a pH sample to the university, they can do a full nutrient analysis for you, which can confirm your need or lack thereof for certain micronutrients such as phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, all of the above. So, but generally speaking, we recommend a balanced fertilizer with the micronutrients in it. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about volcano mulching and lack of airflow. You can see here, these are some really nice pictures. The top one is a severely mulched area, and that tree will very likely end up dying of root rot if they don't get that off there pretty quickly. But looking at the black that's already up the trunk, it may be too late. The second picture there at the bottom has got a little bit less volcano mulching, but you can still see that it's coming up the trunk of that tree. And basically what you want to see is you want to see the top of the root flare. You don't want to see that mulch up against the trunk. And even when the mulch is nice and flat, you still want to keep it pulled away from the trunk at least 6 or 8 inches of a tree and 4 to 6 inches from a shrub. So you can see the picture on the right, that chase tree has been properly mulched. The mulch is nice and flat. And I think what happens a lot of time, I don't think people intentionally do volcano mulching. I think what happens is it's a lot more labor to spread the mulch out correctly from previous years, and they think they need to refresh it annually. And so it ends up just building up. And I see that out here even with some of our demonstration gardens from time to time. And sometimes the best thing is to just get a rake and a shovel and dig it out and start from scratch and apply fresh mulch if you don't like the way it looks after a season or two. Or longer, depending on your personal preference and how much upkeep you want to put into it. But I do see that quite frequently in our residential areas where people refresh the mulch annually, which is good in thought because some mulch will break down, but they're putting on a lot more than what is actually breaking down into the soil. So remember, no volcano mulching, nice flat areas of mulch. Mulch should be no more than 2 to 3 inches deep and always pulled away from the trunk. All right, we're going to talk quickly about landscaping for wildlife. As farm owners, you guys very likely have problems with wildlife. Or not problems, maybe you just see the wildlife out there. So things when I think of problems with wildlife and nuisance wildlife, we talk about coyotes. You may think of some of your larger mammals. I know somebody mentioned earlier in the Q&A box, armadillos, things that are burrowing, your gopher tortoises, which are protected. So if you ever have problems with wildlife, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it and look at what we can do to deter them from your yard. But generally speaking, on the positive side, our farm owners provide an opportunity for landscape to or for wildlife to coexist in our landscapes because our HOAs don't provide a lot of suitable habitat. And so some of you may be familiar with some of the conservation easements that we have across the state with different cattle owners and even the Florida Department of Ag and USDA, where they compensate certain owners for having wildlife easements through their property. So some things you can do when you're talking about attracting wildlife and good wildlife, not necessarily our invasive wildlife like coyotes, but limiting the amount of lawn, increasing diversity, and increasing your vertical layering, which may mean using different ground covers than shrubs and then trees, because that provides habitat for our birds to nest in. Providing snags and brush piles. So if you happen to have a dead tree, if it's not somewhere where it's posing a risk, you could leave it out there. So if it's on the back 40 and it's not bothering anything, leave it out there. The woodpeckers will love it. Oftentimes our farm have a water source. All wildlife are attracted to water. Oftentimes they're attracted to the sound of running water as well, and incorporating in some native vegetation. So other things you can do is removing invasive plants. So I know Caitlin mentioned earlier a significant number of invasive plants, and I'll mention a couple more that you may have heard of or seen in your landscape. So we talked about lantana, that's being invasive, but it is also toxic. Kalanchoe can be invasive and it is toxic. Elephant ears can be extremely invasive and they're toxic. Asparagus fern is another one. Your arrowhead vine. All of those are invasive and toxic, and there's a significant number more of those. So those are double the reason to remove them. So we're always happy to take a look at these plants and help you identify them. If you're not sure, don't hesitate to give us a call and let us know what you're working with. You can certainly provide bird and bat houses. Bird feeders are a great example. Bird feeders and livestock don't usually go well together in the same area because livestock are not beyond eating bird feed. It doesn't bother them a bit. Also, sometimes bird feeders will attract animals that you don't want around your livestock. So I'm thinking armadillos, possums, things like that. I know possums have been known to carry EPM. You're talking bats. We do know bats can potentially carry rabies, but it's not a significant source that I would worry about with livestock. So don't be too concerned if you're wanting to put up bird or bat houses. Manage your indoor pets. So obviously, if you're trying to attract birds and other wildlife and you have farm dogs or a barn kitty, you don't want those two interacting, because generally what happens, especially cats, they are the worst at killing our migratory bird species. So we don't want to set the wildlife up for failure. Also, if you're trying to attract things like birds and butterflies, you don't want to use a lot of pesticides. So you want to make sure that you're watching which chemicals you're using, and maybe consider horticulture soaps rather than broad spectrum pesticides. And then, of course, expanding the scale of the habitat if possible. So merging areas together and leaving wild areas wherever you can. My mouse is very sensitive today. Okay. So, and as we talk about managing yard pests and not using broad spectrum pesticides, here at UF, we call that integrated pest management. And what that does is it looks at prevention and what problems you might have based on the plant species and environmental conditions, and also includes identification as your first point of contact. Because if you don't have a correct identification, you may be killing off beneficial insects that are actually there doing their job. So next, we want to try to select pest-resistant plants and plant them in a place where they are appropriately located. So right plant, right place. Don't overwater and fertilize. People don't always realize that overwatering and over-fertilizing is one of the #1 attractors for pest problems. One, they can sense when a plant is stressed, and two, these plants often die more quickly because they are stressed, and certainly can be overtaken. Also, when you're adding excess water and fertilizer, sometimes the plant may look healthy for a certain point because it's got excess growth, but then all of a sudden it'll look really bad because that excess growth has attracted some really bad bugs to it. Mow at proper heights. So especially if you're working with pasture grass, you do not want to scalp your pastures. Same thing with residential areas. You don't want to scalp your lawns. That will cause big problems. Also, when you mow too low, you may hit tree roots or other areas that will allow for wounds and entry points for diseases into your other plants. If you do have insect problems or disease problems, try to remove any effective leaves. You can pick insects off by hand if you want to. You can spot treat areas that are having issues and use selective herbicides or pesticides as needed. So, and again, Caitlin and I can help direct you to the appropriate products or chemicals. So, and then always, always, always follow label instructions to keep yourself safe. So we talked a little bit about recycling earlier as one of the principles of Florida Friendly Landscaping. And we said that was more recycling yard waste and manures and other scraps of plant material rather than thinking of consumables from our homes. So there are some farms here in Marion County that do a really great job of composting manures. And a lot of them are using that to sell back to the public, which is a really great idea. But we've got to be careful of what hay sources we're using so we know what herbicides could be persisting in those manures. But other things that can be recycled include grass clippings, palm leaves, any kind of limbs that are taken down, even newspapers, Cardboard boxes, if they're broken up small enough, can be used. So you can add worms and do vermicomposting if you choose to. But basically having a compost pile just gives you more material that you can add back into the landscape to add organic matter at a later date. It is important that if you're planning to use compost for any type of vegetable gardens or food products, that you try to use a source in an area that is going to get heated up to between 120 and 130 degrees, and you'll want to try to turn that pile. It also needs some moisture to be able to do its process, but you don't want it where it's getting rained on, where all of the good materials and organic matters that you're trying to focus on get flushed to the bottom of the pile. All right. Stormwater runoff is getting towards the end of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Principles. So needless to say, when it rains, it pours. Water always follows the path of least resistance and will be absorbed into our canals, wetland areas, and it eventually leads out to the ocean. So I always think about our Finding Nemo movies and how everything leads to the ocean, but there is some truth in that. So whether it be lawn runoff, manure runoff, street runoff, or other nutrient sources that are running off into our water sources, this is a source of pollution that we want to try to prevent. This is called non-point source pollution because of the fact that oftentimes these pollution sources are not identifiable. So point source pollution would be more along the lines of if we had a factory or plant where it was a direct source. So other things that kind of flow into our canals and drainage areas and stormwater ponds as it rains and rinses these things off are natural debris, fertilizers, and pesticides, which can contribute to biomagnification in our food chains, and then of course other pollutants. So we want to establish a maintenance-free zone around any type of water body, and the minimum is 10 feet from the water's edge, and no chemicals should be applied there at all. So if you happen to have farm ponds, this is really important to notate. So some of this is in state legislature as far as it is actually in our landscaping rules. I always like to recommend 30 feet as a safety, but obviously 10 feet is the rule. So if you do need to apply fertilizer down towards a pond, make sure that there's a shield on it and you're not getting within that 10 feet safety zone. All right, we're going to transition now from talking a little bit about Florida Friendly Landscape into some more specifics on landscape design and what you can plant if you're looking to improve your landscape around your farm. So first and foremost, plan once, plant once. This is not something that you want to do over and over and over. So I highly recommend at least drafting out some type of a plan of what you're trying to achieve, making some goals, whether it be color oriented or filling a voided space, attracting attention to your front area, whatever it might be, have a plan and have some goals. And then it doesn't have to be a super fancy blueprint drawing to have it drafted out, but this helps you by taking measurements and spacing it out correctly will prevent you from having problems down the road. So let's talk a little bit about the landscape design process. So a good landscape design will incorporate spaces. So whether it be a business area, somewhere for you to have social events, a versatile area that can be used for many different reasons, whether you want to add something that has a little bit of history in it or applying curb appeal, or something that just adds some color and light to your area. These are all things you can do by planning a good landscape design. There are a series of design trends. You can always look some of these up online. There's a great few websites that I'll mention shortly that have some fantastic ideas as far as entertainment spaces and edible landscapes, container gardens and shade gardens. All of those are very, very popular. There may also be some ideas that fit into your landscape as far as living walls or green walls and entertainment spaces. So, but from our perspective, we want to focus on conservation and sustainability at the same time. So with that thought in mind, I always like to mention that if you're not from Florida, you may not be familiar with the natural habitats of Florida. So Florida has 82 unique natural habitats or communities. So sometimes it's really important to take a look at the historical value of the land that you're on before doing a landscape design. So because this is going to look at your soil type. So you can pull up soil maps online, or you can just have your soil tested. I know from my farm, I'm on a big scrub hill. So it is nothing but flatwoods and sand, and there are all kinds of wildlife that pass through, but growing much of anything is not easy. So just something to consider, but I think there's some really unique ecosystem values here, and getting this into your thought process as you look at moving forward can help you overcome some challenges. So you can be sustainable and still have beautiful colors and beautiful textures in your landscape. It doesn't necessarily limit these, but it just helps you plan it more appropriately. So this is an idea of your basic site plan or base map where you've drawn out the basic structure of your home. There are websites that will help you do this these days if you're one that likes technology, or you can just simply draft it out on a sheet of paper. That's what I usually do. But basically you want to look at your main entry points and focal points and see where you want to focus on. And then from there, you build in with your plants. You're going to want to take an inventory of what you already have here. So if you have large live oaks or big pine trees, oops, sorry, skipping over them. That's what you're going to go to next. So you take your site plan and you're going to look at your sun and shade patterns, what vegetation you're planning to keep. Is there any water drainage issues or structures or utilities that need to be avoided? We do have people here in our office, including myself, that can help you with landscape design. So generally speaking, though, this is what we would need to start out with, is a basic inventory of what's already there, some photos, and kind of a base map to start with. So it doesn't have to be exact to give you an idea of what we're working with here. So your site analysis, you want to make sure you're looking for microclimates. So again, any type of water management or water body that's there, any kind of focal points you're looking to achieve. So some people like to block certain views from windows. Other times you want to open that view up. Those are all really important. Or if you have a highway, you may be looking to screen that or screen from the neighbor's place. Something that's very possible too. A lot of times we call that living fences. And then you want to look at your activity zones. So usually we're looking at the front yard as a more public space. This is where you want to really have your curb appeal. You maybe want it where it is something that gets some annuals and really has updated color. Your side yards are work zones, and then the backyard is your private little sanctuary. And you may want it more low maintenance and things that can keep going throughout the year. So perennials that'll come back each year as well are really good for your backyard area. So again, with your front yard, looking for high visibility, focal point areas, adding that color that most of the time annuals can provide, some textural features, and a lot of detail. So other considerations when we continue to work on the design is the ecology of the landscape. So what was there naturally? We already talked about that a little bit. What is your purpose for that property? So if it's letting livestock out occasionally, what can be resistant to that? And then what are your personal preferences as far as aesthetics? So landscape design is something that is very, very personally oriented. So I love focal plants. They're one of the fun parts of landscape design. So these are unusual plants that capture attention or direct a view, and that can even be directing a view away from something that might be a bit of an eyesore. And you do this by using plants of different size, shape, texture, or even color. Other things that can enlighten a garden and really enhance what you're doing are adding fragrance, sound, or even movement into your landscape. So usually movement is like your lighter, wispier plants. Obviously, fragrance can be a multitude of different things, whether it be herbs or several vines have some smelly flowers. And then the sound is usually your larger leaved, larger textured plants. So, and we're not going to go into great detail on texture, form, and color, but just to quickly skip, give you guys a basic understanding of that. Anytime you're looking at redoing your landscape, these are things that you really want to take into consideration. So texture is one of my very favorite things to work with. And you can see here that these palms at the bottom right-hand corner have got a really nice color with that silver gray color, but they also have that wispy texture, the weeping texture that gives it a lot of attraction. So textures can be very coarse, medium, or fine. It can have to do with the arrangement of the leaves or the leaf itself. So definitely look at the arrangement of the twigs and branches with the leaves incorporated. So you can see the fine is, again, kind of the more wispy, light texture. And then the coarse is more your larger leaves, so your palms and philodendrons. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got your general shrubs and trees, and maybe some agave and aloe plants, things like that. Don't plant aloe, by the way. It does have some toxic properties. Not sure it's real toxic, but it can be if it's eaten in quantity. So here's some really great examples of coarse texture. So you can see that these plants have large foliage, rough surface, irregular shapes, thick branches, and overall a little bit larger size. Whereas your fine textures can be more delicate. So either way, you can create different focal points by using these opportunities to incorporate these into your landscape. Remember that when you're looking to plan, you want to remember that your perceived size of space changes depending on what you plant. So if you want a space to look larger, make sure that the fine texture is farther away. So when you want something to look smaller, you want the coarse texture farther away. So, and again, we'll be recording this, you don't have to memorize it, but these are really important. So if you've got a really big space and you don't want people to feel, like it's just overwhelming, then you might want to consider planting more coarse texture to keep it kind of in scale. Next, you want to consider your vertical heights. So looking at shrubs and ground covers and their different forms can provide a lot of diversity for your landscape, which helps with wildlife issues and also can help with your planning as far as some aesthetically pleasing views. A lot of people like arching or cascading shrubs. However, some would prefer the more rounded or upright structures. I personally am not a fan of the super sculpted plants that are kept in either that rounded or mounding form. And oftentimes I go to places that are using plants in that super pruned format that's just super neat and it's not natural. And those particular plants weren't usually developed for that purpose. So they can be pruned and trained that way. But you may end up with some dieback on those trees eventually. So, and you can use form as mass plantings or individual plantings. So a lot of times we see clumping grasses and short plants that are used in mass plantings, but it doesn't always have to be that way. All right, and last thing on landscape design, we're going to get into a little bit on color concepts. So especially on some of our larger farms, we see some really interesting color schemes, which can be really fun to work with. So you can see here, this location has got more of the purples and pinks and blues. We always want to go back and look at that color wheel. So you've got a few things that you can get. You can have your opposite colors or your symmetrical colors. So there's a bunch of ways you can look at these color wheels. So complementary colors, and we're going to look at that just for a minute. So we look at these different color families. These are some examples just to give you some ideas. This is obviously, as it says, red to yellows. I work with a couple farms that don't want anything that's not red or white. I have one farm I know of that is white only. It's got to be white or just an evergreen, and that is it. And then some others are more flexible, like this with the yellows and oranges. Here's another example of blues. So blue and yellow are complementary colors, and I like those colors because they're soft and inviting. Here's an example of blues to reds. So you can see this has got the violets, the blue violets. I really enjoy these colors. The pinks kind of fit in here, but you can always go back to these color wheels, and they are available online. And then if you're not into the colors, you might want to do monochromatic colors. So again, this is your evergreens, your silvers and whites. They have a lot of palms that are in these colors now. Your agaves have these blue silver colors. So colors are superb in today's world. We have done so much breeding with plants that every year they come out with new color arrangements, which is really a fun thing to play with. So, and lastly, just here's one more example of the complementary colors. So you got oranges and blues together, violets and yellows together, and reds and greens. And all of these look fantastic together. It is a personal preference as far as which color scheme you want to go with. So generally with colors, what we try to avoid is just the random putting everything together just because we like it. We went to the store and we decided that that was what we wanted. But yet we don't really know where we're going to put it or what we're going to do. So what we want to make sure of, though, is that we do things that make sense. So whether it be planting in masses or planting individual plants, make sure that we know where our focal points are, know what we want to hide, and use those to our advantage. So, and everything that we just talked about with the landscape design can be found in Dr. Hansen's publication, Color in the Landscape. And she's got several other publications listed here as far as strategies to develop a sustainable landscape. So if you need help with that, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We've got a lot of information on this. It's not always a super fast process, but now's the time of year to start planning. Okay. So a couple of landscape designs that you might want to consider. This is a great example of a farmhouse style landscape, and this has that monochromatic color scheme going in it. You can see that they're using looks like some roses and hydrangeas and a few other things alongside of their turf. One of our new favorite fads is getting edible landscapes in the garden. So you can see this has got the rainbow Swiss chard. It's got some kale growing back there along with some herbs, chives, and other greens. So this can be really fun. And just because you are on a farm, there's no reason you can't incorporate edibles as well. So feel free to play with this if you want to. And if you need more information, don't hesitate to reach out. Another example is living walls, and we do see this a lot on fence lines. In fact, I think we had a question on some of these hedgerows looking for living fences. And yes, you definitely can use living walls as a barrier. Generally, with at least equine and larger livestock, we don't use the living walls as a replacement for a fence, but usually as a secondary fence or as a barrier on top of the fence to prevent noise and in movement from the roadways or other areas that might be neighbors, things like that. But there's many different hedges. I saw a question down here asking about using the natural coffee plants or U-ponds as that living fence. And generally speaking, that would not be my recommendation because those can be toxic. So there are some viburnums such as sweet viburnum that can be used that would not be toxic. So, and lastly, one thing we see on many of our farms is lots of beautiful live oaks. And the challenge that they pose is shady areas. So here's a few examples of some shaded areas that might be really good to add plants into for mass plantings. So you can see here the Xanadu philodendron is one of my favorites, but I also love the shell ginger, caladiums, gardenia, firebush, the blue phlox. Those are all good examples of areas that can be added in to really enhance our landscape and our gardens. So, and if none of those work for you, last but certainly not least, you can always incorporate container gardens. And containers can be made of just about anything. The biggest thing is if you're going to do containers with livestock, you put them in an area where they cannot be knocked over. So with that, we're going to keep moving on. If you need more landscape design ideas, there's some really fun stuff on Pinterest, the Landscaping Network, House, and also some of our vendors. I'm drawing a blank. I'll come back to it in a minute. But they've got some fun container garden ideas. Better Homes and Gardens also has some website ideas. So we'll talk about a little bit more about that. All right. Very quickly, we're going to talk about the plants that we might consider planting in our farm areas or natural areas around our homes. So Caitlin has talked about quite a few of the toxic plants. I'm going to talk about a few more toxic plants and then some that might be more fitting. So, and I love to promote native landscapes, especially on our farmland, just because we see so many invasives. But just because you have natives doesn't mean it all has to be natives. You can have a combination of both. But native landscapes can be very, very beautiful and functional when designed correctly. So when we're looking for trees and shrubs for wildlife, it's really good to think about food sources. But when we think about these food sources, we might also want to consider our livestock. So a few examples of wildlife-friendly trees are red cedar, bald cypress, fringe tree, dayhoon hollies, mulberries, red bay, and live oak. So we already talked about the fact that your live oaks can have tannins in it as far as the acorns. Fringe trees can have some toxins in them, so don't know that I would want to recommend those, but most of these others are pretty livestock friendly. And we don't want to see things like sago palms or kuntis planted that have seeds that will cause significant damage. So on the top right-hand corner here, you can see a holly tree that has some berries on it. I will say some of the holly trees can cause upset tummies if they're being eaten in heavy quantities. But the bottom line is anything can be toxic if it's eaten in enough quantity. So you know, it's really important that we recall that. So I do have some others here that are non-toxic for the most part, but it's really difficult to find plants for our landscape that have no effect on our animals. So a few perennials for wildlife that we like to see in our landscapes that will also do well with our livestock include black-eyed Susans, our blanket flower, porterweed, horse mint, lizard's tail, scorpion tail, and shrimp plant. And all of these should be pretty safe for livestock. I haven't found any information on this. And so we'll go into shrubs. And again, you'll get the recording of this. You don't have to memorize any of this stuff. So your American beautyberry, I'm not sure where my picture went on this one. Florida anise, firebush. Inkberry is not one I would recommend. It is actually toxic. Pawpaw, sea grape, and Simpson stopper all work well. So some others that I know of that we don't recommend because they're toxic, but that we would recommend in a normal setting include fetterbush, boxwood, Obviously, Caitlin already talked about your cherry trees, and I mentioned earlier that elephant ears were toxic. Your arrowhead vines are toxic. Coontie and sagos are toxic. A lot of people like to have asparagus fern in their landscape. Not only is there some asparagus fern that is invasive, but it is also toxic. Podocarpus and amaryllis are toxic. So we've got to be really careful. It's not as much fun when we start talking about how many different things are toxic. So this is one that is often considered a weed, but it's actually can be very beautiful and it's really good for the pollinators. So this is Biden's alba, or Spanish tick, or Spanish needles as it's called. So, and it's not toxic. Oftentimes this will pop up in pastures on its own. This is beautyberry. So beautyberry was always a pasture weed when I grew up, but it provides some beautiful nectar for the birds and butterflies. It provides some great berries, and oftentimes many wildlife, including the bears and raccoons, will eat these berries, but the birds especially love them, and it is non-toxic. So beautyberries become very common, and this is something you may already see in your pastures. Shrimp plants are a common perennial. These are a hummingbird and butterfly plant. They come in a variety of different colors: yellow, white, orange. You can see this kind of peach color here. They're really nice perennial that'll last for years and years. They can add some height because they'll get 4 to 5 foot tall. And of course, like I said, having things that'll add that color are really awesome. There's 2 different types of passion vine. So there's the passion vine that's used for the ornamental source, and then there's also the passion vine that is an edible. So we carry both here at our office. Passion vine provides an extremely good source of nectar for your Gulf fritillary and zebra longwing butterflies. They also provide beautiful arbors and fences. They will look dead. The caterpillars come in and will eat the leaves off of all of them, and you'll think, oh man, that didn't make it. And then next thing you know, it's covered again. So it's ready to rebloom again. So these are good and they are not toxic. So palmettos are something that we see here in Florida quite often, especially as we go south. These provide really good food and cover for wildlife. Oftentimes our livestock don't want to get in them if they're decent size. They can come in a variety of different colors. So palmettos can be a very good addition to home landscapes. And they provide a really nice form with their thick leaves. Dune sunflowers are an awesome variety, especially if you're on a hot sandy hill like I am. These are awesome nectar plants for our butterflies. They can withstand extreme temperatures and also provide a really nice ground cover that supports our frogs and toads and lizards. And I was reading a really nice article this morning about our frogs and lizards being one of the reasons that we don't see some of the persistent tick diseases that we see in some of the northern states. And so anything we can do to help these wildlife out is really good. However, if you have some of the invasive frogs or lizards, don't hesitate to remove those from your landscape. And of course, if you need help identifying them, let me know. I'll be happy to identify them off of either pictures, or you can even bring me a sample. All right, if you're into different grasses that might give some textural components to your landscape, there's some good options out there with native ornamental grasses, including the Fakahatchee grass. So this is an evergreen. You can prune it back without any problems in the winter. There's pink muley grass. There's 2 different varieties. Well, there's multiple varieties of this. There's a dwarf muley grass. There's a bamboo muley grass. There's the regular size muley grass, which is what you're seeing here in this picture. So, but this can be really a nice addition. Generally speaking, I haven't seen livestock that want to eat these ornamental grasses, but I have seen that they are usually providing really good cover for wildlife. So these are good to have around. And then cordgrass is a native grass that is very hardy. And if you're in a wetter area, This will go in both wet and dry land. So cordgrass can be really a good addition if you've got very difficult areas to grow. All right, a few more perennials that we'll talk about here. Blazing Star is a native butterfly plant that's got a really attractive purple flower. It grows back every year. So once you get it established, it'll come back. Usually if these guys freeze off, they'll just grow back from the root. Bee balm is one of my favorites, also called horse mint. I will say your livestock very well may eat this down. However, it is non-toxic. So many, many years ago, Native Americans actually used horse mint to make a tea, and it would treat flu, cold, and fever symptoms. Blue porterweed, there is a native porterweed, and of course there are ornamental porterweeds that are quite a few. The biggest difference between the native and the ornamental varieties that you often find at the stores is the native stays much smaller, more like a ground cover, whereas the ornamentals get not much taller, but they get to be a couple feet tall, whereas the native stays much shorter. But this is also a non-toxic butterfly plant that goes really well in landscapes. There's several different sage varieties that can be used in landscapes. I will say that I prefer the native sages over our tropical sages, but there's different colors, so you can get this in pretty much any color scheme that you choose. Black-eyed Susan is another native butterfly plant that will reseed itself and does very, very well in hot conditions and is very attractive. And then, of course, our official state wildflower, the Coreopsis. And Coreopsis also comes in a variety of colors. Blanket flower is Gaillardia. It's also called dune daisy or native, and it's a native butterfly plant. It also comes in many different colors. This is one of my favorites, and this is a set it and forget it type of plant that will come back every year. It is just about maintenance free. If it gets too overgrown, you can just mow it down and it will come right back when the spring gets ready for everything to start reseeding. Stokes aster is another one that can be really pretty in the landscape and provides a nice texture. The leaves can be almost a silvery blue color, so that can be really pretty. This is one of my favorite shrubs. Plumbago is very hardy. It can freeze back if needed and come back with no problems at all. You can cut it back hard. It is non-toxic. My animals haven't bothered it yet, but I know I don't have to worry about it. It blooms prolifically, so it looks really nice. The butterflies love it, so that's fun. But it'll get up to a pretty decent size. So plumbago and firebush are two of my favorites. If you do have fence lines that you're trying to dress up, trumpet honeysuckle is a native vine that will grow really well here, and it is non-toxic, and you can see that it has the tubular flowers that the hummingbirds seek out. And then if you're looking for something that's more of a shrubby type plant, Walter's viburnum is a native shrub, and the critters do usually eat the drupes or the berries that are produced on it in the autumn. So this is a great plant if you've got a lot of wild birds and you're looking to keep up with that. Most of the viburnum species I mentioned earlier that the native coffee plant could be toxic. So you might want to consider your viburnums. This is possum haw, but there's sweet viburnum, there's Walter's viburnum. Most of the viburnums are not toxic, so they're a great option for farms. These guys do produce nice flowers. They produce prolific fruits that are loved by all of the wildlife, birds and mammals alike. So here's another one, our Florida anise. It's got a nice little red flower. This is one I don't see frequently. So it's kind of unique. Wax myrtle is another one that's a native shrub that we see frequently used as a hedgerow or fence row. Firebush produces a very nice yellow-orange flower. Again, this is one that there are native and ornamental varieties, and the difference in the varieties is, again, size with both width and height, and there's also a small difference in the shade of the flower colors. So where one has more yellow and the other is more orange and red. This plant does really well in shade. Again, you can get the dwarf varieties that go 3 to 4 foot tall, or the native varieties that can be 5 to 10 feet tall with no problems. So depending on the space that you have available. Few trees that we'll talk about are the American elm is a good one. Doesn't have, doesn't show up as any kind of toxic features to it. Again, pretty much anything can be toxic if it's eaten in enough quantity. I personally like the American holly because generally the thorns on it detour our livestock from eating it. Not always, but any of the holly trees can cause stomach upset if they eat enough of the berries, but in general, they're not significantly toxic. Our bald cypress is really good if you've got wet areas. Of course, it's a native. It can get rather large. It does produce some of the knees, but it's a really good one. Yopon holly, again, much like the American holly, it produces these red berries the birds absolutely love. We're going to skip fringe tree. Let's talk a little bit about redbud. Redbud can be really good. However, it's not the easiest to grow. The flowers on it are absolutely beautiful if you can get it established, but it needs to be an understory tree. So it needs to be in slight shade. And I have seen wildlife and livestock alike nibble parts of it, but it is not toxic. So it's very pretty, but again, not always the most hardy. Our American hornbeam is a good tree to plant. So this tries to get some ideas out here that might not be what you typically have on your mind. And then one of my favorite is river birch, which has the peeling bark. Really unique gray textures to this tree. It is deciduous, so it loses its leaves in the fall, but it'll come back nice and green, and it is non-toxic. And then a few wildlife favorites here are our hog plum, which you may already have on your farm growing wild, and our Chickasaw plum. Both of these species are very similar. They do produce edible fruit. My husband always likes to trick the kids by giving them the fruit because the fruit are very sour, but you can make jams and jellies. So there's definitely, there's no problems with toxicity there. They have a beautiful flower on them. So these can be bought locally. And like I said, the hog plum actually grows wild here. So you may have some of those already on your farmland. All right. And with that, any questions? And Caitlin has posted our post test. So if you would please take take just a couple minutes and complete that. And Christy posted that Spanish needle or Biden's alba has so many seeds. And yes, Christy, you are absolutely right. It is loaded with seeds, but it does have a pretty flower and is a native pollinator plant. So awesome, guys. Well, thank you for your time and any questions.
Thanks, Maxine. And yeah, I'll just remind everybody, I did just put a link to your post tests. And again, that's a separate link from what you got in my email Friday. So if you would take 2 minutes to click that and answer those questions, we would appreciate it. You will be getting an email from me at some point in the next few days, and I will remind you about the post test as well as give you the recording to this presentation as soon as I have it downloaded and edited up. So you can expect that from us shortly.
Thanks, Caitlin. And just a reminder, if you want to look at plants for your yard, you can go to floridayards.org. And if you need to double check anything as far as toxicity goes, you can certainly reach out to myself or Caitlin. But the ASPCA.org website has a significant list of both toxic and non-toxic plants. So that's one you can refer to. There's some other websites out there as well, but I think that's probably one of the most lengthy and comprehensive. Thoughts on that, Caitlin?
Oh, that sounds good. Christy's asking about a list of pasture safe shade trees. I'm not sure we have a super extensive list, but Maxine might know a couple.
Sure. You know, we just talked about some. You could look at the elm and the hornbeam for sure. Generally speaking, unless you're working with a horse that is just really bad about eating everything, the oaks are fine, because unless they eat a lot of acorns, they're not going to have problems with that.
Yes. I don't see any other questions. So with that, I'm going to stop this recording.